Chapter 24 of The House with the Green Shutters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The House with the Green Shutters by George Douglas Brown. Chapter 24. There had been fine cackling in Barbie as Gourlay's men dropped away from him one by one, and now it was worse than ever. When Jimmy Bain and Sandy Cross were dismissed last winter, "He canna last long now," mused the bodies. And then, when even Riney got the sack, "Lord," they cried, "this mun be the end o't." The downfall of Gourlay had an unholy fascination for his neighbours, and that not merely because of their dislike to the man. That was a whet to their curiosity, of course, but over and above it they seemed to be watching, with bated breath, for the final collapse of an edifice that was bound to fall. Simple expectation held them. It was a dramatic interest, of suspense, yet certainty, that had them in its grip. "He's bound to come down," said certainty. "Yes, but when, though?" cried curiosity, all the more eager because of its instinct for the coming crash. And so they waited for the great catastrophe which they felt to be so near. It was as if they were watching the tragedy near at hand, and noting with keen interest every step in it that must lead to inevitable ruin. That invariably happens when a family tragedy is played out in the midst of a small community. Each step in it is discussed with a prying interest that is neither malevolent nor sympathetic, but simply curious. In this case it was chiefly malevolent, only because Gourlay had been such a brute to Barbie. Though there were thus two reasons for public interest, the result was one and the same, a constant tittle-tattling. Particular spite and a more general curiosity brought the grain merchant's name onto every tongue. Not even in the gauzy days of its prosperity had the house with the green shutters been so much talked of. "Pride will have a downcome," said some, with a gleg look and a smack of the lip, trying to veil their personal malevolence in a common proverb. "He's simply in debt in every corner," goldered the keener spirits. "He never had a brain for business. He's had money for stuff he's unable to deliver. Not a day gangs by but the big blue envelopes are coming. How do I ken, say ye? How do I ken, indeed? Oh, I ken perfectly. Perfectly. It was Postie himsel that telled me." Yet all this was merely guesswork. For Gourlay had hitherto gone away from Barbie for his moneys and accommodations, so that the bodies could only surmise. They had nothing definite to go on. And through it all the gurly old fellow kept a brave front to the world. He was thinking of retiring, he said, and gradually drawing in his business. This offhand and lordly, to hide the patent diminution of his trade. "He, he," said the old provost, with a cruel laugh, when he heard of Gourlay's remark. "Drawing in his business, aye. It's like Lan Jean Lingleton's waist, I'm thinking. It's thin enough drawn already's." On the morning of the last market day he was ever to see in Barbie, old Gourlay was standing at the green gate when the postman came up with a smirk and put a letter in his hand. He betrayed a wish to hover in gossip, while Gourlay opened his letter, but "Less lip," said surly John, and the fellow went away. Ere he had reached the corner, a gowl of anger and grief struck his ear, and he wheeled eagerly. Gourlay was standing with open mouth and outstretched arm, staring at the letter in his clenched fist with a look of horror, as if it had stung him. "My God!" he cried. "Had I not enough to thole?" "Aha!" thought Postie. "Yon letter Wilson got this morning was correct, then. His son had sent the true story. That letter o' Gourlay's had the Edinburgh postmark. Somebody has sent him word about his son. Lord, what a titbit for my rounds." Mrs. Gourlay, who was washing dishes, looked up to see her husband standing in the kitchen door. His face frightened her. She had often seen the blaze in his eye, and often the dark scowl, but never this bloodless pallor in his cheek. Yet his eyes were flaming. "Ay, ay," he burred. "A fine job you have made of him." "Oh, what is it?" she quavered, and the dish she was wiping clashed on the floor. "That's it," said he. That's it. Break the dishes next. Break the dishes. Everything seems gone to smash. If you keep on lang enough, you'll put a bonny end til't, or you're by wit, the lot o' ye." The taunt passed in the anxiety that stormed her. "Tell me, see!" she cried, imperious in stress of appeal. "Oh, what is it, John?" She stretched out her thin red hands and clasped them tightly before her. "Is it from Edinburgh? Is there anything the matter with my boy? Is there anything the matter with my boy?" The hard eye surveyed her a while in grim contempt of her weakness. She was a fluttering thing in his grip. "Everything's the matter with your boy," he sneered slowly. "Everything's the matter with your boy. And it's your fault too, damn you, for you have always spoilt him." With sudden wrath he strode over to the famous range and threw the letter within the great fender. "What is it?" he cried, wheeling round on his wife. "The son you were so wild about sending to college has been flung in disgrace from its door. That's what it is." He swept from the house like a madman. Mrs. Gourlay sank into her old nursing chair and wailed. "Oh, my Wayne, my dear, my poor dear!" She drew the letter from the ashes, but could not read it for her tears. The words drunkenness and expulsion swam before her eyes. The manner of his disgrace she did not care to hear. She only knew her firstborn was in sorrow. "Oh, my son," she cried, "my laddie, my wee laddie!" She was thinking of the time when he trotted at her petticoat. It was market day, and Gourlay must face the town. There was interest due on a mortgage, which he could not pay. He must swallow his pride and try to borrow it in Barbie. He thought of trying Johnny Coe, for Johnny was of yielding nature, and had never been unfriendly. He turned, 20 yards from his gate, and looked at the house with the green shutters. He had often turned to look back with pride at the gauzy building on its terrace, but never as he looked today. All that his life meant was bound up in that house. It had been the pride of the Gourlays. Now it was no longer his, and the Gourlays' pride was in the dust, their name a byword. As Gourlay looked, a robin was perched on the quiet roof-tree, its breast vivid in the sun. One of his metaphors flashed at the sight. "Seamus sitting there too," he muttered, and added with a proud angry snarl, "on the rigging o' my hoose." He had a triple wrath to his son. He had not only ruined his own life, he had destroyed his father's hope that by entering the ministry he might restore the Gourlay reputation. Above all, he had disgraced the house with the green shutters. That was the crown of his offending. Gourlay felt for the house of his pride even more than for himself. Rather, the house was himself. There was no division between them. He had built it bluff to represent him to the world. It was his character in stone and lime. He clung to it as the dull, fierce mind, unable to live in thought, clings to a material source of pride. And John had disgraced it. Even if fortune took a turn for the better, green shutters would be laughed at the country over as the home of a prodigal. As he went by the cross, Wilson, provost this long while, broke off a conversation with Templandmuir to yell, "It's grand weather, Mr. Gourlay." The men had not spoken for years, so to shout at poor Gourlay in his black hour from the pinnacle of civic greatness was a fine stroke. It was gloating, it was rubbing in the contrast. The words were innocent, but that was nothing. Whatever the remark, for a declared enemy to address Gourlay in his shame was an insult. That was why Wilson addressed him. There was something in the very loudness of his tones that cried plainly, "Aha, Gourlay, your son has disgraced you, my man." Gourlay glowered at the animal and plodded dourly. Ere he had gone 10 yards, a coarse laugh came bellowing behind him. They saw the colour surge up the back of his neck to the roots of his hair. He stopped. Was his son's disgrace known in Barbie already? He had hoped to get through the market day without anybody knowing. But Wilson had a son in Edinburgh. He had written, it was like. The salutation, therefore, and a laugh had both been uttered in derision. He wheeled, his face black with the passionate blood. His mouth yawed with anger. His voice had a moan of intensity. "What are ye laughing at?" he said with a mastering quietness. "Eh? Just tell me, please, what you're laughing at." He was crouching for the grip, his hands out like a gorilla's. The quiet voice, from the yawing mouth, beneath the steady flaming eyes, was deadly. There is something inhuman in a rage so still. "Eh?" he said slowly, and the moan seemed to come from the midst of a vast intensity rather than a human being. It was the question that must grind an answer. Wilson was wishing to all his gods that he had not insulted this awful man. He remembered what had happened to Gibson. This, he had heard, was the very voice with which Gourlay moaned, "Take your hand off my shouther," ere he hurled Gibson through the window of the Red Lion. Barbie might soon want a new provost if he ran in now. But there is always one way of evading punishment for a veiled insult, and of adding to its sting by your evasion. Repudiate the remotest thought of the protester. Thus you enjoy your previous jibe with the additional pleasure of making your victim seem a fool for thinking you referred to him. You not only insult him on the first count, but send him off with an additional hint that he isn't worth your notice. Wilson was an adept in the art. "Man," he lied blandly, but his voice was quivering, "man, I wasn't so much as giving ye a thought. It's very strange if I cannot pass a joke with my old friend Templand Muir without you calling me to book. It's a free country, I suppose? You weren't in my mind at all. I have more important matters to think of," he ventured to add, seeing he had baffled Gourlay. For Gourlay was baffled. For a directer insult, an offensive gesture, one fierce word, he would have hammered the road with the provost. But he was helpless before the bland, quivering lie. Maybe they werena referring to him. Maybe they knew nothing of John in Edinburgh. Maybe he had been foolishly suspicious. A subtle yet baffling check was put upon his anger. Madman as he was in wrath, he never struck without direct provocation. There was none in this pulpy gentleness, and he was too dull of wit to get round the common ruse and find a means of getting at them. He let loose a great breath through his nostrils, as if releasing a deadly force which he had pent within him, ready should he need to spring. His mouth opened again, and he gaped at them with a great, round, unseeing stare. Then he swung on his heel. But wrath clung round him like a garment. His anger fed on its uncertainties. For that is the beauty of the Wilson method of insult. You leave the poison in your victim's blood, and he torments himself. Was Wilson referring to me, after all? He pondered slowly, and his body surged at the thought. If he was, I have let him get away unkilled. And he clutched the hands whence Wilson had escaped. Suddenly a flashing thought stopped him dead in the middle of his walk, staring hornily before him. He had seen the point at last that a quicker man would have seized on it at first. Why had Wilson thrust his damned voice on him on this particular morning of all days in the year, if he was not gloating over some news which he had just heard about the Gourlays? It was as plain as daylight. His son had sent word from Edinburgh. That was why he brayed and ho-ho-hoed when Gourlay went by. Gourlay felt a great flutter of pulses against his collar. There was a pain in his throat, an ache of madness in his breast. He turned once more. But Wilson and the Templar had withdrawn discreetly to the Black Bull. The street wasna canny. Gourlay resumed his way, his being a dumb gowl of rage. His angry thoughts swept to John. Each insult and fancied insult he endured that day was another item in the long account of vengeance with his son. It was John who had brought all this flaming round his ears. John whose colleging he had lippened to so muckle. The staff on which he leaned had pierced him. By the eternal heavens, he would tramp it into atoms. His legs felt John beneath them. As the market grew busy, Gourlay was the aim of innumerable eyes. He would turn his head to find himself the object of a queer, considering look. Then the eyes of the starer would flutter, abashed, as though detected spying the forbidden. The most innocent look at him was poison. Do they know? Was his constant thought. Have they heard the news? What's Laura and Hogie looking at me like that for? Not a man ventured to address him about John. He had cowed them too long. One man, however, showed a wish to try. A pretended sympathy from behind the veil of which you probe a man's anguish at your ease is a favourite weapon of human beasts anxious to wound. The Deacon longed to try it on Gourlay, but his courage failed him. It was the only time he was ever worsted in malignity. Never a man went forth, bowed down with a recent shame, wounded and wincing from the public gaze, but that old rogue hirpled up to him, and lisped with false smoothness. "Thirst me, neighbour, I'm thorry for ye. This is a terrible affair. It's on everybody's tongue. But ye have my sympathy, neighbour. Ye have that, my warmest sympathy." And all the while the shifty eyes above the lying mouth would peer and probe, to see if the soul within the other was writhing at his words. Now, though everybody was spying at Gourlay in the market, all were giving him a wide berth, for they knew that he was dangerous. He was no longer the man whom they had baited on the way to Skeighan. Then he had some control. Now 3 years' calamities had fretted his temper to a raw wound. To flick it was perilous. Great was the surprise of the starers, therefore, when the idle old Deacon was seen to detach himself and hail the grain merchant. Gourlay wheeled and waited with a levelled eye. All were agog at the sight. Something would be sure to come of this. Here would be an encounter worth the speaking o'. But the Deacon, having toddled forward a bittock on his thin shanks, stopped half-roads, took snuff, trumpeted into his big red handkerchief, and then, feebly waving, "I'll see ye again, John," clean turned tail and toddled back to his cronies. A roar went up at his expense. "God," said Tam Wylie, "did ye see yon?" Gourlay stopped him wi' a glower. But the laugh was maddening to Gourlay. Its readiness, its volume, showed him that scores of folk had him in their minds, were watching him, considering his position, cognizant of where he stood. They ken, he thought. They were all waiting to see what would happen. They wanted to watch how Gourlay tholed the mention o' his son's disgrace. I'm a kind o' show to them. Johnny Coe, idle and well to pass, though he had no business of his own to attend to, was always present where business men assembled. It was a grand way of getting news. Today, however, Gourlay could not find him. He went into the cattle mart to see if he was there. For 2 years now, Barbie had a market for cattle, on the first Tuesday of the month. The auctioneer, a jovial dog, was in the middle of his roaring game. A big red bullock, the coat of which made a rich colour in the ring, came bounding in, scared at its surroundings, staring one moment and the next careering. "There's meat for you," said he of the hammer. "See how it runs. How much am I offered for this fine bullock?" He sing-songed, always saying, "This fine bullock," in exactly the same tone of voice. £13 for this fine bullock. 13.5, 13.10, 13.10 for this fine bullock. 13.10. Any further bids on 13.10? Why, it's worth that for the colour o't. Thank ye, sir. 13.15, £14. £14 for this fine bullock. See how the stoats about the ring. That joke should raise him another half-sovereign. Ah, knew it would. 14.5, 14.5 for this fine bullock. 14.10, no more than 14.10 for this fine bullock. Going at 14.10. Gone, Irren Davy." Now that he was in the circle, however, the mad big handsome beast refused to go out again. When the cattleman would drive him to the yard, he snorted and galloped round, till he had to be driven from the ring with blows. When at last he bounded through the door, he flung up his heels with a bellow, and sent the sand of his arena showering on the people round. "I say," roared Brodie in his coarsest voice, from the side of the ring opposite to Gourlay. "I say, auctioneer, that mun be a college-bred stot from the way he behaves. He flung dirt at his masters and had to be expelled." "Put Brodie in the ring and ripe him," cried Irren Davy. "He roars like a bill at ony rate." There was a laugh at Brodie, true, but it was at Gourlay that 100 big red faces turned to look. He did not look at them, though. He sent his eyes across the ring at Brodie. "Lord," said Irren Davy, "it's weel for Brodie that the ring's acqueesh them. Gourlay'll murder somebody yet. Red hell lap out o' his een when he looked at Brodie." Gourlay's suspicion that his son's disgrace was a matter of common knowledge had now become a certainty. Brodie's taunt showed that everybody knew it. He walked out of the building very quietly, pale but resolute. No meanness in his carriage, no cowering. He was an arresting figure of a man as he stood for a moment in the door and looked round for the man whom he was seeking. "Weel, weel," he was thinking, "I'm on thole, I suppose. They were under my feet for many a day, and they're taking their advantage now." But though he could thole, his anger against John was none the less. It was because they had been under his feet for many a day that John's conduct was the more heinous. It was his son's conduct that gave Gourlay's enemies their first opportunity against him, that enabled them to turn the tables. They might sneer at his trollop of a wife, they might sneer at his want of mere cleverness. Still he held his head high amongst them. They might suspect his poverty, but so far, for anything they knew, he might have thousands behind him. He owed not a man in Barbie. The appointments of green shutters were as brave as ever. The selling of his horses, the dismissal of his men, might mean the completion of a fortune, not its loss. Hitherto, then, he was invulnerable, so he reasoned. It was his son's disgrace that gave the men he had trodden under foot the first weapon they could use against him. That was why it was more damnable in Gourlay's eyes than the conduct of all the prodigals that ever lived. It had enabled his foes to get their knife into him at last, and they were turning the dagger in the wound. All owing to the boy on whom he had staked such hopes of keeping up the Gourlay name. His account with John was lengthening steadily. Coe was nowhere to be seen. At last Gourlay made up his mind to go out and make inquiries at his house, out the Flecky road. It was a quiet, big house, standing by itself, and Gourlay was glad there was nobody to see him. It was Miss Coe herself who answered his knock at the door. She was a withered old shrew with 50 times the spunk of Johnny. On her thin wrists and long hands there was always a pair of bright red mittens, only her finger-tips showing. Her far sunken and toothless mouth was always working, with a sucking motion of the lips, and her round little knob of a sticking-out chin munched up and down when she spoke, a long, stiff, whitish hair slanting out its middle. However much you wished to avoid doing so, you could not keep your eyes from staring at that solitary hair while she was addressing you. It worked up and down so, keeping time to every word she spoke. "Is your brother in?" said Gourlay. He was too near reality in this sad pass of his to think of mistering. "Is your brother in?" said he. "No-a," she shrilled, for Miss Coe answered questions with an old maidish scream, as if the news she was giving must be a great surprise both to you and her. "No-a," she skirled. "He's no-a in-a. Was it anything particular?" "No," said Gourlay heavily. I just wanted to see him," and he trudged away. Miss Coe looked after him for a moment ere she closed the door. "He's wanting to borrow money," she cried. "I'm nearly sure o't. I'm on caution Johnny when he comes back frae Flecky, afore he gangs east the toon. Gourlay could get him to do ocht. He always admired the brute, I'm sure I kenna why. 'Cause he's siccan a silly body himsell, I suppose." It was after dark when Gourlay met Coe in the street. He drew him aside in the shadows and asked for a loan of £80. Johnny stammered a refusal. "Off the bawbees is mine," his sister had skirled, "and adore ye to do ony siccan thing, John Coe." "It's only for a time," pleaded Gourlay, "and by God," he flashed, "it's hell in my throat to ask from any man." "No, no, Mr. Gourlay," said Johnny, "it's quite impossible. I've always looked up to ye, and I'm not unwilling to oblige ye, but I cannot take the risk." "Risk?" said Gourlay, and stared at the darkness. By hook or by crook he must raise the money to save the house with the green shutters. It was no use trying the bank. He had a letter from the banker on his desk to tell him that his account was overdrawn. And yet if the interest were not paid at once, the lawyers in Glasgow would foreclose, and the Gourlays would be flung upon the street. His proud soul must eat dirt, if need be, for the sake of £80. "If I get the baker or Tam Wylie to stand security," he asked, "would ye not oblige me? I think they would do it. I have always felt they respected me." "Well," said Johnny slowly, fearing his sister's anger, "if ye get the baker and Tam Wylie for security, I'll be in the street for another half hour." A figure muffled in a greatcoat was seen stealing off through the shadows. "God's curse on whoever that is," snarled Gourlay, creeping up to listen to our talk. "I don't think so," said Johnny. "It seemed a young chap trying to hide himself." Gourlay failed to get his securities. The baker, though a poor man, would have stood for him if Tam Wylie would have joined. But Tam would not budge. He was as clean as grey granite, and as hard. So Gourlay trudged home through the darkness, beaten at last, mad with shame and anger and foreboding. The first thing he saw on entering the kitchen was his son, sitting muffled in his coat by the great fender. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The House with the Green Shutters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The House with the Green Shutters by George Douglas Brown. Chapter 25. Janet and her mother saw a quiver run through Gourlay as he stood and glowered from the threshold. He seemed of monstrous bulk and significance, filling the doorway in his silence. The quiver that went through him was a sign of his contending angers, his will struggling with the tumult of wrath that threatened to spoil his revenge. To fell that huddled oaf with a blow would be a poor return for all he had endured because of him. He meant to sweat punishment out of him, drop by drop, with slow and vicious enjoyment. But the sudden sight of that living disgrace to the Gourlays woke a wild desire to leap on him at once and glut his rage, a madness which only a will like his could control. He quivered with the effort to keep it in. To bring a beaten and degraded look into a man's face, rend manhood out of him in fear, is a sight that makes decent men wince in pain. For it is an outrage on the decency of life, an offence to natural religion, a violation of the human sanctities. Yet Gourlay had done it once and again. I saw him down a man at the cross once, a big man with a Viking beard, dark brown, from which he would have looked for manliness. Gourlay, with stabbing eyes, threatened and burred and downed him, till he crept away with a face like chalk and a hunted, furtive eye. Curiously, it was his manly beard that made the look such a pain, for its contrasting colour showed the white face of the coward, and a coward had no right to such a beard. A grim and cruel smile went after him as he slunk away. "Ha!" barked Gourlay, in lordly and pursuing scorn, and the fellow leapt where he walked as the cry went through him. To break a man's spirit so, take that from him which he will never recover while he lives, send him slinking away animo castrato, for that is what it comes to, is a sinister outrage of the world. It is as bad as the rape of a woman, and ranks with the sin against the Holy Ghost, derives from it indeed. Yet it was this outrage that Gourlay meant to work upon his son. He would work him down and down, this son of his, till he was less than a man, a frightened, furtive animal. Then, perhaps, he would give a loose to his other rage, unbuckle his belt, and thrash the grown man like a wriggling urchin on the floor. As he stood glowering from the door, Mrs. Gourlay rose with an appealing cry of "John!" But Gourlay put his eye on her, and she sank into her chair, staring up at him in terror. The strings of the tawdry cap she wore seemed to choke her, and she unfastened them with nervous fingers, fumbling long beneath her lifted chin to get them loose. She did not remove the cap, but let the strings dangle by her jaw, the silly bits of cloth waggling and quivering as she turned her head repeatedly from son to husband and from husband to son, added to her air of helplessness and inefficiency. Once she whispered with ghastly intensity, "God have mercy!" For a length of time there was a loaded silence. Gourlay went up to the hearth and looked down on his son from near at hand. John shrank down in his greatcoat. A reek of alcohol rose from around him. Janet whimpered. But when Gourlay spoke it was with deadly quietude. The moan was in his voice. So great was his controlled wrath that he drew in great shivering breastfuls of air between the words, as if for strength to utter them, and they quavered forth on it again. He seemed weakened by his own rage. "Ay, man," he breathed, "ye've won hame, I observe. Dear me! Umph!" The contrast between the lowness of his voice and his steady breathing anger that possessed the air, they felt it coming as in waves, was demoniac, appalling. John could not speak. He was paralyzed by fear. To have this vast hostile force touch him, yet be still, struck him dumb. Why did his father not break out on him at once? What did he mean? What was he going to do? The jamb of the fireplace cut his right shoulder as he cowered into it, to get away as far as he could. "I'm saying ye've won hame," quivered Gourlay in a deadly slowness, and his eyes never left his son. And still the son made no reply. In the silence the ticking of the big clock seemed to fill their world. They were conscious of nothing else. It smote the ear. "Ay," John gulped at last from a throat that felt closing. The answer seemed dragged out of him by the insistent silence. "Just so," breathed his father, and his eyes opened in wide flame. He heaved with the great breath he drew. "Humph!" he drawled. He went through to the scullery at the back of the kitchen to wash his hands. Through the open door Janet and her mother, looking at each other with affrighted eyes, could hear him sneering at intervals. "Ay, man, just that now. Umph!" And again, "Ay, ay, dear me," in grim falsetto irony. When he came back to the kitchen he turned to Janet and left his son in a suspended agony. "Ay, woman, Jenny, you're there," he said, and nipped her ear as he passed over to his chair. "Were ye in skeeing the day?" "Ay, faither," she answered. "And what did the skeeing doctor say?" She raised her large pale eyes to his with a strange look. Then her head sank low on her breast. "Nothing," she said at last. "Nothing," said he. "Nothing for nothing, then. I hope you didna pay him." "No, faither," she answered. "I hadna the bawbees." "When did you get back?" he asked. Just after... Her eyes flickered over to John, as if she were afraid of mentioning his name. "Oh, just after this gentleman. But there's nothing strange in that. You were always after him. You were born after him, and considered after him. He aye had the best o't." "I hope you are in good health," he sneered, turning to his son. "It would never do for a man to break down at the outset o' a great career. For ye are at the outset o' a great career, are ye na?" His speech was as soft as the foot of a tiger, ensheathed as rending a cruelty. There was no escaping the crouching stealth of it. If he had leapt with a roar, John's drunken fury might have lashed itself to rage, but the younger and weaker man was fascinated and helpless before the creeping approach of so monstrous a wrath. "Eh?" asked Gourlay softly, when John made no reply. "I'm saying you're at the outset o' a great career, are ye no? Eh?" Soft as his "eh" was in utterance, it was insinuating, pursuing. It had to be answered. "No," whimpered John. "Well, well, you're maybe at the end o't. Have ye been studying hard?" "Yes," lied John. "That's right!" cried his father with great heartiness. "There's my brave fellow! Nothing like studying. And no doubt," he leaned over suavely, "and no doubt you've brought a wheen prizes home wi' ye as usual. Eh?" There was no answer. "Eh?" "No," gulped the cowrer. "Nae prizes!" cried Gourlay, and his eyebrows went up in pretended surprise. "Nae prizes! Ay, man. Fau's that na?" Young Gourlay was being reduced to the condition of a beaten child who, when his mother asks if he has been a bad boy, is made to sob "Yes" at her knee. "Have you been a good boy?" she asks. "No," he pants. "And are you sorry for being a bad boy?" "Yes," he sobs. "And will you be a good boy now, then?" "Yes," he almost shrieks, in his desire to be at one with his mother. Young Gourlay was being equally beaten from his own nature, equally battered under by another personality. Only he was not asked to be a good boy. He might gang to hell for anything auld Gourlay cared, when once he had bye with him. Even as he degraded his son to this state of unnatural cowardice, Gourlay felt a vast disgust swell within him that a son of his should be such a coward. "Damn him," he thought, glowering with big-eyed contempt at the huddled creature. "He hasna the pluck o' a pig. How can he stand talk like this without showing he's a man? When I was a child on the brisket, if a man had used me as I'm using him, I would have flung myself at him. He's a pretty-looking object to carry the name of John Gourlay. My God, what a keogh of my life I've made! That old trollop for my wife, that sumph for my son, and that dying lassie for my dochter. Was it I that bred him? That?" He leapt to his feet in devilish merriment. "Set out the spirits, Jenny!" he cried. "Set out the spirits! My son and I must have a drink together, to celebrate the occasion. Oh, ay," he sneered, drawling out the word with sharp, unfamiliar sound, "just to celebrate the occasion." The wild humour that seized him was inevitable, born of a vicious effort to control a rage that was constantly increasing, fed by the sight of the offender. Every time he glanced across at the thing sitting there he was swept with fresh surges of fury and disgust, but his vicious constraint curbed them under, and refused him a natural expression. They sought an unnatural. Some vent they must have, and they found it in a score of wild devilries he began to practise on his son. Wrath fed and checked in one brings the hell on which man is built to the surface. Gourlay was transformed. He had a fluency of speech, a power of banter, a readiness of tongue, which he had never shown before. He was beyond himself. Have you heard the snarl with which a wild beast arrests the escaping prey which it has just let go in enjoying cruelty? Gourlay was that animal. For a moment he would cease to torture his son, feed his disgust with a glower, then the sight of him huddled there would wake a desire to stamp on him, but his will would not allow that, for it would spoil the sport he had set his mind on, and so he played with the victim, which he would not kill. "Set out the spirits, Jenny," he birred, when she wavered in fear. "What are ye shaking for? Set out the spirits, just to celebrate the joyful occasion, you know. Ay, ay, just to celebrate the joyful occasion." Janet brought a tray, with glasses, from the pantry. As she walked, the rims of the glasses shivered and tinkled against each other from her trembling. Then she set a bottle on the table. Gourlay sent it crashing to the floor. "A bottle!" he roared. "A bottle for us twa! To hell wi' bottles! The jar, Jenny, the jar! Set out the jar, lass, set out the jar! For we mean to make a night of it, this gentleman and me. Ay," he yawed with a vicious smile, "we will make a night o't, we two, a night that Barbie'll remember long." "Have ye skill o' drink?" he asked, turning to his son. "No," wheezed John. "No!" cried his father. "I thought ye learned everything at college. Your education's been neglected, but I'll teach ye a lesson, or this nicht's by. Ay, by God," he growled, "I'll teach ye a lesson." Curb his temper as he might, his own behaviour was lashing it to frenzy. Through the moaning intensity peculiar to his vicious rage there leapt at times a wild beast snarl. Every time they heard it, it cut the veins of his listeners with a start of fear, it leapt so suddenly. "Hey, sir!" he cried. John raised his dull white face and looked across at the bumper which his father poured him, but he felt the limbs too weak beneath him to go and take it. "Bide where ye are," sneered his father. "Bide where ye are. I'll wait on ye. I'll wait on ye. Man, I waited on ye the day that ye were born. The heavens were hammering the world as John Gourlay rode through the storm for a doctor to bring hame his heir. The world was feared, but he wasna feared," he roared in titanic pride. "He wasna feared. No, by God, for he never met what scored him. Aye, aye, he birred softly again. Aye, aye, ye were ushered loudly to the world, sir. Verra appropriate for a man who was destined to make such a name, eh? Verra appropriate, sir. Verra appropriate. And you'll be ushered just as loudly out o't. Oh, young Gourlay's death maun make a splurge, ye know, a splurge to attract folks' attention. John's shaking hand was wet with the spilled whisky. "Take it off," sneered his father, boring into him with a vicious eye. "Take it off, sir. Take off your dram." "Stop! Somebody wrote something about that. Some poetry or other. Who was it?" "I dinna ken," whimpered John. "Don't tell lies now. You do ken. I heard you mention it to Loranogie. Come on now, who was it?" "It was Burns," said John. "Oh, it was Burns, was it? And what had Mr. Burns to say on the subject, eh?" "Freedom and whisky gang thegither. Tak aff your dram," stammered John. "A verra wise remark," said Gourlay gravely. "Freedom and whisky gang thegither." He turned the quotation on his tongue as if he were savouring a titbit. "That's verra good," he approved. "You're a great admirer of Burns, I hear, eh?" "Yes," said John. "Do what he bids ye, then. Take off your dram. It'll show what a fine free fellow ye are." It was a big old-fashioned Scotch drinking glass, containing more than half a gill of whisky, and John drained it to the bottom. To him it had been a deadly thing at first, coming thus from his father's hand. He had taken it into his own with a feeling of aversion that was strangely blended of disgust and fear. But the moment it touched his lips, desire leapt in his throat to get at it. "Good!" roared his father in mock admiration. "God, ye have the thrapple! When I was your age, that would have choked me. I must have a look at that throat o' yours. Stand up! Stand up when I tollie!" John rose swaying to his feet. Months of constant tippling, culminating in a wild debauch, had shattered him. He stood in a reeling world, and the fear weakening his limbs changed his drunken stupor to a heart-heaving sickness. He swayed to and fro, with a cold sweat oozing from his chalky face. "What's ado with the fellow?" cried Gourlay. He's swinging like a saw wand. I must walk around this and have a look." John's drunken submissiveness encouraged his father to new devilries. The ease with which he tortured him provoked him to more torture. He went on more and more viciously, as if he were conducting an experiment, to see how much the creature would bear before he turned. Gourlay was enjoying the glutting of his own wrath. He turned his son round with a finger and thumb on his shoulder, in insolent inspection, as you turn an urchin round to see him in his new suit of clothes. Then he crouched before him, his face thrust close to the other, and peered into his eyes, his mouth distent with an infernal smile. "My boy, Johnny," he said sweetly, "my boy, Johnny," and patted him gently on the cheek. John raised dull eyes and looked into his father's. Far within him a great wrath was gathering through his fear. Another voice, another self, seemed to whimper with dull iteration. "I'll kill him! I'll kill him! By God, I'll kill him, if he doesna stop this, if he keeps on like this at me!" But his present and material self was paralysed with fear. "Open your mouth!" came the snarl. "Wider, damn ye, wider!" "Umph!" said Gourlay, with a critical drawl, pulling John's chin about to see into him the deeper. "Umph! God, it's like a furnace. What's the Latin for throat?" "Gutter," said John. "Gutter," said his father. "A verra appropriate name. Yours stinks like a cesspool. What have you been doing till't? I'm afraid ye aren't in very good health, after all, eh? Mrs. Gourlay, Mrs. Gourlay! He's in very bad case, this son of yours, Mrs. Gourlay. Fine I ken what he needs, though. Set out the brandy, Jenny, set out the brandy," he roared. "Whisky's not worth a damn for him. Stop! It was you gaed the last time. It's your turn now, old wife. It's your turn now. Gang for the brandy to your twa John Gourlays. We're a pair for a woman to be proud of." He gazed after his wife as she tottered to the pantry. "Your skirt's on the gape, auld wife," he sang. "Your skirt's on the gape as usual," he drawled. "As usual. It was always like that, and it always scunnered me, for I like things tidy, though I never got them. However, I maunna compleen when ye bore sic a braw son to my name. He's a great consolation. He is that, a great consolation." The brandy bottle slipped from the quivering fingers and was smashed to pieces on the floor. "Hurrah!" yelled Gourlay. He seemed rapt and carried by his own devilry. The wreck and ruin strewn about the floor consorted with the ruin of his fortunes. Let all go smash. What was the use of caring? Now in his frenzy, he, ordinarily so careful, seemed to delight in the smashings and the breakings. They suited his despair. He saw that his spirit of destruction frightened him, too, and that was another reason to indulge it. "To hell with everything!" he yelled, like a mock bacchanal. "We're the hearty fellows. We'll make a red night now we're at it." And with that he took the heel of a bottle on his toe and sent it flying among the dishes on the dresser. A great plate fell, split in two. "Poor fellow!" he whined, turning to his son. "Poor fellow! I fear he has lost his physic, for that was the last bottle of brandy in my ocht, the last John Gourlay had, the last he'll ever buy. What am I to do wi' ye now? Eh? I must do something. It's coming to the bit now, sir." As he stood in a heaving silence, the sobbing of the two women was heard through the room. John was still swaying on the floor. Sometimes Gourlay would run the full length of the kitchen and stand there glowering on a stoop. Then he would come crouching up to his son on a vicious little trot, pattering in rage, the broken glass crunching and grinding beneath his feet. At any moment he might spring. "What do you think I mean to do wi' ye now?" he moaned. "Eh? What do ye think I mean to do wi' ye now?" As he came grinning in rage, his lips ran out to their full width, and the tense slit showed his teeth to their roots. The gums were white. The stricture of the lips had squeezed them bloodless. He went back to the dresser once more and bent low beside it, glancing at his son across his left shoulder, with his head flung back sideways, his right fist clenched low and ready from a curve of the elbow. It swung heavy as a mallet by his thigh. Janet got to her knees and came shuffling across the floor on them, though her dress was tripping her, clasping her outstretched hands and sobbing in appeal. "Faither, faither, oh, faither, for God's sake, faither!" She clung to him. He unclenched his fist and lifted her away. Then he came crouching and quivering across the floor slowly, a gleaming devilry in the eyes that devoured his son. His hands were like outstretched claws, and shivered with each shiver of the voice that moaned through set teeth. "What do you think I mean to do wi' ye now? What do you think I mean to do wi' ye now? Ye damned sorrow and disgrace that ye are! What do you think I mean to do wi' ye now?" "Run, John!" screamed Mrs. Gourlay, leaping to her feet. With a hunted cry young Gourlay sprang to the door. So great had been the fixity of Gourlay's wrath, so tense had he been in one direction, as he moved slowly on his prey, that he could not leap to prevent him. As John plunged into the cool, soft darkness, his mother's "Thank God!" rang past him on the night. His immediate feeling was of coolness and width and spaciousness, in contrast with the hot grinding hostility that had bored so closely in on him for the last hour. He felt the benignness of the darkened heavens. A tag of some forgotten poem he had read came back to his mind, and "Come, kindly night, and cover me," he muttered, with shaking lips, and felt how true it was. My God, what a relief to be free of his father's eyes! They had held him till his mother's voice broke the spell. They seemed to burn him now. What a fool he had been to face his father when empty both of food and drink! Every man was downhearted when he was empty. If his mother had had time to get the tea it would have been different, but the fire been out when he went in. "He wouldn't have downed me so easy if I had had anything in me," he muttered, and his anger grew as he thought of all he had been made to suffer. For he was still the swaggerer. Now that the incubus of his father's tyranny no longer pressed on him directly, a great hate rose within him for the tyrant. He would go back and have it out when he was primed. "It's the only hame I have," he sobbed angrily to the darkness. "I have no other place to gang till. Yes, I'll go back and have it out with him when once I get something in me, so I will." It was no disgrace to suck courage from the bottle for that encounter with his father, for nobody could stand up to Black Gourlay, nobody. Young Gourlay was yielding to a peculiar fatalism of minds diseased. All that affects them seems different from all that affects everybody else. They are even proud of their separate and peculiar doom. Young Gourlay not thought but felt it. He was different from everybody else. The heavens had cursed nobody else with such a terrible sire. It was no cowardice to fill yourself with drink before you faced him. A drunkard will howl you an obscene chorus the moment after he has wept about his dead child. For a mind in the delirium of drink is no longer a coherent whole, but a heap of shattered bits, which it shows one after the other to the world. Hence the many transformations of that semi-madness and their quick variety. Young Gourlay was showing them now. His had always been a wandering mind, deficient in application and control, and as he neared his final collapse, it became more and more variable, the prey of each momentary thought. In a short 5 minutes of time he had been alive to the beauty of the darkness, cowering before the memory of his father's eyes, sobbing in self-pity and angry resolve, shaking in terror. Indeed, he was shaking now, but his vanity came uppermost. As he neared the Red Lion he stopped suddenly, and the darkness seemed on fire against his cheeks. He would have to face curious eyes, he reflected. It was from the Red Lion he and Aird had started so grandly in the autumn. It would never do to come slinking back like a whipped cur. He must carry it off bravely in case the usual busybodies should be gathered round the bar. So with his coat flapping lordly on either side of him, his hands deep in his trousers pockets, and his hat on the back of his head, he drove at the swing doors with an outshot chest and entered with a breenge. But for all his swagger, he must have had a face like death, for there was a cry among the idlers. A man breathed, "My God, what's the matter?" With shaking knees Gourlay advanced to the bar, and, "For God's sake, Aggie," he whispered, "give me a Kinblythement." It went at a gulp. "Another," he gasped, like a man dying of thirst, whom his first sip maddens for more. "Another, another!" He had tossed the other down his burning throat when Deacon Allardyce came in. He knew his man the moment he set eyes on him, but standing at the door he arched his hand above his brow, as you do in gazing at a dear unexpected friend, whom you pretend not to be quite sure of, so surprised and pleased are you to see him there. "Ith it John?" he cried. "It ith John!" And he toddled forward with outstretched hand. "Man, John," he said again, as if he could scarce believe the good news, and he waggled the other's hand up and down, with both his own clasped over it. "I'm proud to thee you, thir, I am that. And tho you're one hame, ay, and how are ye tummin on?" "Oh, I'm all right, Deacon," said Gourlay with a silly laugh. "Have a wet?" The whisky had begun to warm him. "A what?" said the Deacon, blinking in a puzzled fashion with his bleary old eyes. "A dram, a drink, a drop o' the old kirk," said Gourlay with a stertorous laugh down through his nostrils. "He, he!" laughed the Deacon in his best falsetto. "Ith that what ye call it up in Edinbro? A wet, ay. Ah, well, maybe I will take a little drope, seeing you're tho ready wi' your offer." They drank together. "Aggie, fill me a mutchkin when you're at it," said Gourlay to the pretty barmaid with the curly hair. He had spent many an hour with her last summer in the bar. The 4 big whiskies he had swallowed in the last half hour were singing in him now, and he blinked at her drunkenly. There was a scarlet ribbon on her dark curls, coquettish, vivid, and Gourlay stared at it dreamily, partly in a drunken daze, and partly because a striking colour always brought a musing and self-forgetting look within his eyes. All his life he used to stare at things dreamily, and come to himself with a start when spoken to. He forgot himself now. "Aggie," he said, and put his hand out to hers clumsily where it rested on the counter. "Aggie, that ribbon's infernal bonny on your dark hair." She tossed her head and perked away from him on her little high heels. Him, indeed, the drunkard. She wanted none of his compliments. There were half a dozen in the place by this time, and they all stared with greedy eyes. "That's young Gourlay, him that was expelled," was heard, the last an emphatic whisper, with round eyes of awe at the offence that must have merited such punishment. "Expelled, mind ye," with a round shake of the head. "Watch Allardyce, we'll see fun." "What's this expelled is now?" said John Toodle, with a very considering look and tone in his uplifted face. "Properly speaking, that is," he added, implying that of course he knew the word in its ordinary sense, but was not sure of it properly speaking. "Flung out," said Drucken Wabster, speaking from the fullness of his own experience. "Whisht," said a third. "Here's Tam Brodie. Watch what he does." The entrance of Brodie spoiled sport for the Deacon. He had nothing of that malicious finesse that made Allardyce a genius at nicking men on the raw. He went straight to his work, stabbing like an awl. "Hallo!" he cried, pausing with contempt in the middle of the word, when he saw young Gourlay. "Hallo! You here? Brig o' the Mains, miss, if you please. Ay, man. God, you've been making a name up in Embro. I hear you stood up till him, Guy Weel," and he winked openly to those around. Young Gourlay's maddened nature broke at the insult. "Damn you!" he screamed. "Leave me alone, will you? I have done nothing to you, have I?" Brodie stared at him across his suspended whisky glass, an easy and assured contempt curling his lip. "Don't greet o'er it, my bairn," said he, and even as he spoke John's glass shivered on his grinning teeth. Brodie leapt on him, lifted him, and sent him flying. "That's a game of your father's, you damned dog," he roared, "but there's mair than him can play the game." "Canny, my freendth, canny," piped Allardyce, who was vexed at a fine chance for his peculiar craft being spoiled by mere brutality of handling. All this was most inartistic. Brodie never had the fine stroke. Gourlay picked himself bleeding from the floor, and, holding a handkerchief to his mouth, plunged headlong from the room. He heard the derisive roar that came after him stop, strangled by the sharp swing to of the door, but it seemed to echo in his burning ears as he strode madly on through the darkness. He uncorked his mutchkin and drank it like water. His swollen lips smarted at first, but he drank till it was a mere dead lump to his tongue, and he could not feel the whisky on the wound. His mind at first was a burning whirl through drink and rage, with nothing determined and nothing definite, but thought began to shape itself. In a vast vague circle of consciousness his mind seemed to sit in the centre and think with preternatural clearness. Though all around was whirling and confused, drink had endowed some inner eye of the brain with unnatural swift vividness. Far within the humming circle of his mind he saw an instant and terrible revenge on Brodie, acted it and lived it now. His desires were murderers, and he had let them slip, gloating in the cruelties that hot fancy wreaked upon his enemy. Then he suddenly remembered his father. A rush of fiery blood seemed to drench all his body as he thought of what had passed between them. "But, by heaven," he swore, as he threw away his empty bottle, "he won't use me like that another time. I have blood in me now." His maddened fancy began building a new scene, with the same actors, the same conditions as the other, but an issue gloriously diverse. With vicious delight he heard his father use the same sneers, the same gibes, the same brutalities. Then he turned suddenly and had him under foot, kicking, bludgeoning, stamping the life out. He would do it, by heaven he would do it. The memory of what had happened came fierily back, and made the pressing darkness burn. His wrath was brimming on the edge, ready to burst, and he felt proudly that it would no longer ebb in fear. Whisky had killed fear and left a hysterical madman, all the more dangerous because he was so weak. Let his father try it on now. He was ready for him. And his father was ready for him, for he knew what had happened at the inn. Mrs. Webster, on her nightly hunt for the man she had sworn to honour and obey, having drawn several public houses blank, ran him to earth at last in the bar-room of the Red Lion. "Yes, yes, Kirsty," he cried, eager to prevent her tongue. "I know I'm a blagyard, but oh, the terrible thing that has happened!" He so possessed her with his graphic tale that he was allowed to go chuckling back to his potations, while she ran hot-foot to the green shutters. "Eh, poor Mrs. Gourlay, and oh, you poor boy too, and that brute Tam Brodie." Even as she came through the door, the voluble clatter was shrilling out the big tidings, before she was aware of Gourlay's presence. She faltered beneath his black glower. "Go on," he said, and ground it out of her. "A damned sumph," he growled, "to let Brodie hammer him." For a moment, it is true, his anger was divided, stood in equipoise, even dipped Brodie-ward. "I've an account to sattle wi' him," he thought grimly. "When I get my claw in his neck, I'll teach him better than to hit a Gourlay. I wonder," he mused, with a pride in which was neither doubt nor wonder, "I wonder will he fling the father as he flang the son?" But that was the instinct of his blood, not enough to make him pardon John. On the contrary, here was a new offence of his offspring. On the morrow Barbie would be burning with another affront which he had put upon the name of Gourlay. He would waste no time when he came back, be he drunk or be he sober. He would strip the flesh off him. "Jenny," he said, "bring me the step-ladder." He would pass the time till the prodigal came back, and he was almost certain to come back, for where could he go in Barbie? He would pass the time by trying to improve the appearance of the house. He had spent money on his house till the last, and even now had the instinct to embellish it. Not that it mattered to him now. Still, he could carry out a small improvement he had planned before. The kitchen was ceiled in dark timber, and on the rich brown rafters there were wooden pegs and bars for the hanging of Gourlay's sticks and fishing rods. His gun was up there, too, just above the hearth. It had occurred to him about a month ago, however, that a pair of curving steel rests that would catch the glint from the fire would look better beneath his gun than the dull pegs, where it now lay against a joist. He might as well pass the time by putting them up. The bringing of the steps, light though they were, was too much for Janet's weak frame, and she stopped in a fit of coughing, clutching the ladder for support, while it shook to her spasms. "Tuts, Jenny, this'll never do," said Gourlay, not unkindly. He took the ladder away from her and laid his hand on her shoulder. "Away to your bed, lass. Ye munna sit so late." But Janet was anxious for her brother, and wanted to sit up till he came home. She answered "yes" to her father, but idled discreetly to consume the time. "Where's my hammer?" snarled Gourlay. "Is it no by the clock?" said his wife wearily. "Oh, I remember. I gied it to Mrs. Webster to break some bree-stone, to rub the front doorstep wi'. It'll be lying in the porch." "Oh, ay, as usual," said Gourlay, "as usual." "John!" she cried in alarm. "You don't mean to take down the gun, do ye?" "Huts, you old fool, what are you skirling for? Do you think I mean to shoot the dog? Set back in your creepy and make less noise, will ye?" Ere he had driven a nail in the rafter, John came in and sat down by the fire, taking up the great poker as if to cover his nervousness. If Gourlay had been on the floor he would have grappled with him there and then, but the temptation to gloat over his victim from his present height was irresistible. He went up another step and sat down on the very summit of the ladder, his feet resting on one of the lower rounds. The hammer he had been using was lying on his thigh, his hand clutched about its haft. "Ay, man, you've been taking a bit walk, I hear." John made no reply, but played with the poker. It was so huge, owing to Gourlay's whim, that when it slid through his fingers it came down on the muffled hearthstone with a thud like a paviour's hammer. "I'm told you saw the Deacon on your rounds. Did he compliment you on your return?" At the quiet sneer a lightning flash showed John that Allardyce had quizzed him too. For a moment he was conscious of a vast self-pity. "Damn them, they're all down on me," he thought. Then a vindictive rage against them all took hold of him, tense, quivering. "Did you see Thomas Brodie when you were out?" came the suave inquiry. "I saw him," said John, raising fierce eyes to his father's. He was proud of the sudden firmness in his voice. There was no fear in it, no quivering. He was beyond caring what happened to the world or him. "Oh, you saw him!" roared Gourlay, as his anger leapt to meet the anger of his son. "And what did he say to you, may I speir? Or maybe I should speir what he did, eh?" He grinned. "By God, I'll kill ye!" screamed John, springing to his feet with the poker in his hand. The hammer went whizzing past his ear. Mrs. Gourlay screamed and tried to rise from her chair, her eyes goggling in terror. As Gourlay leapt, John brought the huge poker with a crash on the descending brow. The fiercest joy of his life was a dirl that went up his arm as the steel thrilled to its own hard impact on the bone. Gourlay thudded on the fender, his brow crashing on the rim. At the blow there had been a cry as of animals from the two women. There followed an eternity of silence, it seemed, and a haze about the place. Yet not a haze, for everything was intensely clear, only it belonged to another world. One terrible fact had changed the universe. The air was different now. It was full of murder. Everything in the room had a new significance, a sinister meaning. The effect was that of an unholy spell. As through a dream, Mrs. Gourlay's voice was heard crying on her God. John stood there, suddenly weak in his limbs, and stared as if petrified at the red poker in his hand. A little wisp of grizzled hair stuck to the square of it, severed as if by scissors, between the sharp edge and the bone. It was the sight of that bit of hair that roused him from his stupor. It seemed so monstrous and horrible, sticking all by itself to the poker. "I didna strike him so hard," he pleaded, staring vaguely. "I didna strike him so hard." Now that the frenzy had left him, he failed to realize the force of his own blow. Then, with a horrid fear on him, "Get up, faither," he entreated. "Get up, faither. Oh, man, ye micht get up." Janet, who had bent above the fallen man, raised an ashen face to her brother and whispered hoarsely, "His heart has stopped, John. You have killed him." Steps were heard coming through the scullery. In the fear of discovery, Mrs. Gourlay shook off the apathy that held her paralysed. She sprang up, snatched the poker from her son, and thrust it in the embers. "Run, John, run for the doctor!" she screamed. "Oh, Mrs. Webster, Mrs. Webster, I'm glad to see. Mr. Gourlay fell from the top o' the ladder and smashed his brow on the muckle fender." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The House with the Green Shutters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The House with the Green Shutters by George Douglas Brown. Chapter 26. "Mother!" came the startled whisper. "Mother! O woman, waken and speak to me!" No comforting answer came from the darkness to tell of a human being close at hand. The girl, intently listening, was alone with her fear. All was silent in the room, and the terror deepened. Then the far-off sound in the house was heard once more. "Mother! Mother! What's that?" "What is it, Janet?" came a feebly complaining voice. "What's wrong wi' ye, lassie?" Janet and her mother were sleeping in the big bedroom, Janet in the place that had been her father's. He had been buried through the day, the second day after his murder. Mrs. Gourlay had shown a feverish anxiety to get the corpse out the house as soon as possible, and there had been nothing to prevent it. "Oh," said Dr. Dandy to the gossips, "it would have killed any man to fall from such a height on to the sharp edge of yon fender." "No, he was not quite dead when I got to him. He opened his eyes on me once, a terrible look, and then life went out of him with a great quiver." Ere Janet could answer her mother, she was seized with a racking cough, and her hoarse bark sounded hollow in the silence. At last she sat up and gasped fearfully, I thought I heard something moving." "It would be the wind," plained her mother. "It would just be the wind. John's asleep this strucken hour and mair. I sat by his bed for a lang while, and he prigged and prayed for a dose o' the whisky ere he won away. He wouldna let go my hand till he slept, poor fallow. There's an unco fear in him, an unco fear. But try and fa o'er," she soothed her daughter. "That would just be the wind ye heard." "There's nae wind," said Janet. The stair creaked. The two women clung to each other, gripping tight fingers, and their hearts throbbed like big separate beings in their breasts. There was a rustle, as of something coming. Then the door opened, and John flitted to the bedside with a candle in his hand. Above his nightshirt his bloodless face looked grey. "Mother," he panted, "there's something in my room." "What is it, John?" said his mother, in surprise and fear. I thocht it was himsel. Oh, mother, I'm feared, I'm feared. Oh, mother, I'm feared." He sang the words in a hysterical chant, his voice rising at the end. The door of the bedroom clicked. It was not a slamming sound, only the door went to gently, as if someone closed it. John dropped the candle from his shaking hand and was left standing in the living darkness. "Save me!" he screamed, and leaped into the bed, burrowing down between the women till his head was covered by the bedclothes. He trembled so violently that the bed shook beneath them. "Let me bide wi' ye," he pleaded, with chattering jaws. "Oh, let me bide wi' ye! I daurna gang back to that room by mysel' again." His mother put her thin arm round him. "Yes, dear," she said, "you may bide wi' us. Janet and me wouldna let anything harm you." She placed her hand on his brow caressingly. His hair was damp with a cold sweat. He reeked of alcohol. Someone went through the square playing a concertina. That sound of the careless world came strangely in upon their lonely tragedy. By contrast, the cheerful silly noise out there seemed to intensify their darkness and isolation here. Occasional far-off shouts were heard from roisterers going home. Mrs. Gourlay lay staring at the darkness with intent eyes. What horror might assail her she did not know, but she was ready to meet it for the sake of John. "Ye brought it on yoursel," she breathed once, as if defying an unseen accuser. It was hours ere he slept, but at last a heavy sough told her he had found oblivion. "He's won o'er," she murmured thankfully. At times he muttered in his sleep, and at times Janet coughed hoarsely at his ear. "Janet, dinna hoast so loud, woman. You'll waken your brother." Janet was silent. Then she choked, trying to stifle another cough. "Woman," said her mother complainingly, "that's surely an unco hoast ye hae." "Ay," said Janet, "it's a gey hoast." Next morning, Posty came clattering through the paved yard in his tackety boots, and handed in a blue envelope at the back door with a businesslike air, his ferrety eyes searching Mrs. Gourlay's face as she took the letter from his hand. But she betrayed nothing to his curiosity, since she knew nothing of her husband's affairs, and had no fear, therefore, of what the letter might portend. She received the missive with a vacant unconcern. It was addressed to John Gourlay, Esquire. She turned it over in a silly puzzlement, and "Janet," she cried, "what am I to do with this?" She shrank from opening a letter addressed to her dead tyrant, unless she had Janet by her side. It was so many years since he had allowed her to take an active interest in their common life (indeed he never had), that she was as helpless as a child. "It's to feyther," said Janet. "Shall I waken John?" "No, poor fellow. Let him sleep," said his mother. "I stole in to look at him enow, and his face was unco wan, lying down on the pillow. I'll open the letter mysel, though, as your father used to tell me, I never had a heed for business." She broke the seal, and Janet, looking over her shoulder, read aloud to her slower mind. Glasgow, March the 12th. Sir, we desire once more to call your attention to the fact that the arrears of interest on the mortgage of your house have not been paid. Our client is unwilling to proceed to extremities, but unless you make some arrangement within a week, he will be forced to take the necessary steps to safeguard his interests. Yours faithfully, Brodie, Gurney and Yarrowby. Mrs. Gourlay sank into a chair, and the letter slipped from her upturned palm, lying slack upon her knee. "Janet," she said appealingly, "what's this that has come on us? Does the house we live in, the house with the green shutters, not belong to us any more? Tell me, lassie, what does it mean?" "I don't ken," whispered Janet, with big eyes. "Did feyther never tell ye of the bond?" "He never telled me about anything," cried Mrs. Gourlay with a sudden passion. "I was aye the one to be keep it in the dark, and sore hadn't doon. Oh, are we left destitute, Janet? And us was aye sae muckle thocht o', and me too, that's come of decent folk, and brought him a gey pickle bawbees. Am I to be in the parish in my auld age? Oh, my feyther, my feyther!" Her mind flashed back to the jocose and well-to-do father who had been but a blurred thought to her for 20 years. That his daughter should come to a pass like this was enough to make him turn in his grave. Janet was astonished by her sudden passion and feebleness. Even the murder of her husband had been met by her weak mind with a dazed resignation, for her natural horror at the deed was swallowed by her anxiety to shield the murderer, and she experienced a vague relief, felt but not considered, at being freed from the incubus of Gourlay's tyranny. It seemed, too, as if she was incapable of feeling anything poignantly, deadened now by these quick calamities, but that she, that 10-shilling land's daughter, should come to be an object of common charity, touched some hidden nerve of pride and made her writhe in agony. "It mayna be sae bad," Janet tried to comfort her. "Waken John," said her mother feverishly. "Waken John, and we'll gang through his feyther's desk. There may be something good amang his papers. There may be something good," she gabbled nervously. "Yes, there may be something good. In the desk. There may be something good in the desk." John staggered into the kitchen 5 minutes later. Halfway to the table where his mother sat, he reeled and fell over on a chair, where he lay with an ashen face, his eyes mere slits in his head, the upturned whites showing through. They brought him whisky, and he drank and was recovered. And then they went through to the parlour and opened the great desk that stood in the corner. It was the first time they had ever dared to raise its lid. John took up a letter lying loosely on the top of the other papers, and after a hasty glance, "This settles it," said he. It was the note from Gourlay's banker, warning him that his account was overdrawn. "God help us!" cried Mrs. Gourlay, and Janet began to whimper. John slipped out of the room. He was still in his stocking feet, and the women, dazed by this sudden and appalling news, were scarcely aware of his departure. He passed through the kitchen and stood on the step of the back door, looking out on the quiet little paved yard. Everything there was remarkably still and bright. It was an early spring that year, and the hot March sun beat down on him, paining his bleared and puffy eyes. The contrast between his own lump of a body, drink-dazed, dull-throbbing, and the warm, bright day came in on him with a sudden sinking of the heart, a sense of degradation and personal abasement. He realized, however obscurely, that he was an eyesore in nature, a blotch on the surface of the world, an offence to the sweet breathing heavens. And that bright silence was so strange and still, he could have screamed to escape it. The slow ticking of the kitchen clock seemed to beat upon his raw brain. Damn the thing, why didn't it stop, with its monotonous tick-tack, tick-tack, tick-tack? He could feel it inside his head, where it seemed to strike innumerable little blows on a strained cord it was bent on snapping. He tiptoed back to the kitchen on noiseless feet, and cocking his ear to listen, he heard the murmur of women's voices in the parlour. There was a look of slyness and cunning in his face, and his eyes glittered with desire. The whisky was still on the table. He seized the bottle greedily, and tilting it up, let the raw liquid gurgle into him like cooling water. It seemed to flood his parched being with a new vitality. "Oh, I doubt we'll be gey ill off," he heard his mother whine, and at that reminder of her nearness he checked the great satisfied breath he had begun to blow. He set the bottle on the table, bringing the glass noiselessly down upon the wood with a tense, unnatural precision possible only to drink-steadied nerves, a steadiness like the humming tops whirled to its fastest. Then he sped silently through the courtyard and locked himself into the stable, chuckling in drunken triumph as he turned the key. He pitched forward on a litter of dirty straw, and in a moment sleep came over his mind in a huge wave of darkness. An hour later he woke from a terrible dream, flinging his arms up to ward off a face that had been pressing on his own. Were the eyes that had burned his brain still glaring above him? He looked about him in drunken wonder. From a sky window a shaft of golden light came slanting into the loose box, living with yellow motes in the dimness. The world seemed dead. He was alone in the silent building, and from without there was no sound. Then a panic terror flashed in his mind that those eyes had actually been here, and were here with him still, where he was locked up with them alone. He strained his eyeballs in a horrified stare at vacancy. Then he shut them in terror, for why did he look? If he looked, the eyes might burn on him out of nothingness. The innocent air had become his enemy, pregnant with unseen terrors to glare at him. To breathe it stifled him. Each draught of it was full of menace. With a shrill cry he dashed at the door and felt in the clutch of his ghostly enemy when he failed to open it at once, breaking his nails on the baffling lock. He mowed and chattered and stamped, and tore at the lock, frustrate in fear. At last he was free. He broke into the kitchen where his mother sat weeping. She raised her eyes to see a dishevelled thing, with bits of straw scattered on his clothes and hair. "Mother!" he screamed, "Mother!" and stopped suddenly, his starting eyes seeming to follow something in the room. "What are ye glowering at, John?" she wailed. "They damned een," he said slowly. "They're burning my soul. Look, look!" he cried, clutching her thin wrist. "See there, coming round by the dresser. Ah!" he screamed in hoarse execration. "Would ye then?" And he hurled a great jug from the table at the pursuing unseen. The jug struck the yellow face of the clock, and the glass jangled on the floor. Mrs. Gourlay raised her arms, like a gaunt sibyl, and spoke to her Maker quietly, as if he were a man before her in the room. "Ruin and murder," she said slowly, "and madness, and death at my nipple like a child. When will ye be satisfied?" Drucken Wabster's wife spread the news, of course, and that night it went humming through the town that young Gourlay had the horrors, and was throwing tumblers at his mother. "Poor Bodie," said the baker, in the long-drawn tones of an infinite compassion. "Poor Bodie." "Ay," said Toddle dryly. "He'll be wanting to put an end to her next, after killing his father." "Killing his father?" said the baker with a quick look. "What do you mean?" "Mean? Oh, I just mean what the doctor says. Gourlay was that mad at the drucken young swine that he got the plexies, fell aff the ladder, and felled himsel deed. That's what I mean, no less," said Toddle, nettled at the sharp question. "Ay, man, that accounts for't," said Tam Welly. "It did seem queer, Gourlay's dying the very nicht the prodigal cam hame. He was a heavy man, too. He would come down with an infernal thud. It seems uncanny, though, it seems uncanny." "Strange," murmured another, and they looked at each other in silent wonder. "But will this be true, think ye?" said Brodie. "About the horrors, I mean. Did he throw the tumbler at his mother?" "Lord, it's true," said Sandy Toddle. "I gaed into the kitchen on purpose to make sure of the matter with my own eyes. I let on I wanted to borrow auld Gourlay's keyhole saw. I can tell ye he had a' his orders. His tool chest's the finest I ever saw in my life. I mean to bid for some o' yon when the rowp comes. Weel, as I was saying, I let on I wanted the wee saw, and went into the kitchen one end's errand. The tumbler, Johnny Coe says it was a bottle, however, but I'm no avised o' that, I speered Webster's wife, and I think my details are correct. The tumbler went flying past his mother and smashed the face o' the 8th day. It happened about the mid-hour o' the day. The clock had stopped it, I observed, at 3.5 minutes to the 12. "Hey!" cried the Deacon. "It's a pity old Gourlay wathna alive thith day." "Faith, aye," cried Wiley. "He would have sorted him. He would have trimmed the young ruffian." "No doubt," said the Deacon gravely. "No doubt. But it was scarcely that I was thinking of." "Ja," he grinned. This would have been a slap in the face to him. Wiley looked at him for a while, with a white scunner in his face. He wore the musing and disgusted look of a man whose wounded mind retires within itself to brood over a sight of unnatural cruelty. The deacon grew uncomfortable beneath his sideward estimating eye. "Deacon Allardyce, your heart's black rotten," he said at last. The deacon blinked and was silent. Tam had summed him up. There was no appeal. "John, dear," said his mother that evening, "we'll take the big sofa into our bedroom and make up a grand bed for ye, and then we'll be company to one another. Eh, dear?" she pleaded. "Winna that be a fine way? When you have Janet and me beside you, you winna be feared o' anything coming near you. You should gang to bed early, dear, as sleep would restore your mind." "I don't mean to go to bed," he said slowly. He spoke staringly, with the same fixity in his voice and gaze. There was neither rise nor fall in his voice, only a dull level of intensity. "You don't mean to go to bed, John? What for, dear? Man, sleep would calm your mind for ye." "Na." He smiled and shook his head like a cunning madman who had detected her trying to get round him. "Na. No sleep for me, no sleep for me. I'm feared I would see the red een," he whispered. "The red een coming at me out of the darkness, the darkness." He nodded, staring at her and breathing the word. "The darkness, the darkness. The darkness is the worst, mother," he added in his natural voice, leaning forward as if he explained some simple, curious thing of every day. "The darkness is the worst, you know. I've seen them in the broad licht, but in the lobby," he whispered hoarsely, "in the lobby when it was dark. In the lobby they were terrible. Just twa een, and they aye keep thegither, though they're aye moving. That's why I canna pin them, and it's because I ken they're aye watching me, watching me, watching me, that I get so feared. They're red," he nodded and whispered. "They're red, they're red." His mouth gaped in horror, and he stared as if he saw them now. He had boasted long ago of being able to see things inside his head. In his drunken hysteria he was to see them always. The vision he beheld against the darkness of his mind projected itself and glared at him. He was pursued by a spectre in his own brain, and for that reason there was no escape. Wherever he went, it followed him. "Oh, man, John," wailed his mother, "what are ye feared for your faither's een for? He wouldna persecute his boy." "Would he no?" he said slowly. "You ken yoursel that he never liked me, and naebody could stand his glower. Oh, he was a terrible man, my faither. You could feel the passion in him when he stood still. He could throw himsel at ye without moving, and he's throwing himsel at me frae beyond the grave." Mrs. Gourlay beat her desperate hands. Her feeble remonstrance was a snowflake on a hill to the dull intensity of this conviction. So colossal was it that it gripped herself, and she glanced dreadfully across her shoulder. But in spite of her fears, she must plead with him to save. "Johnny, dear," she wept passionately, "there's no een. It's just the drink gars ye think sae." "No," he said dully, "the drink's my refuge. It's a kind thing, drink. It helps a body." "But, John, nobody believes in these things nowadays. It's just fancy in you. I wonder at a college-bred man like you giving heed to a wheen nonsense." "Ye ken yoursel it was a byword in the place that he would haunt the house with the green shutters." "God help me!" cried Mrs. Gourlay. "What am I to do?" She piled up a great fire in the parlour, and the three poor creatures gathered round it for the night. They were afraid to sit in the kitchen of an evening, for even the silent furniture seemed to talk of the murder it had witnessed. John was on a carpet stool by his mother's feet, his head resting on her knee. They heard the rattle of Wilson's brake as it swung over the town head from Ochiltree, and the laughter of its jovial crew. They heard the town clock chiming the lonesome passage of the hours. A dog was barking in the street. Gradually all other sounds died away. "Mother," said John, "lay your hand alang my shouther, touching my neck. I want to be sure that you're near me." "I'll do that, my bairn," said his mother, and soon he was asleep. Janet was reading a novel. The children had their mother's silly gift, a gift of the weak-minded. of forgetting their own duties and their own sorrows in a vacant interest which they found in books. She had wrapped a piece of coarse red flannel round her head to comfort a swollen jaw, and her face appeared from within like a tallowy oval. "I didna get that story finished," said Mrs. Gourlay vacantly, staring at the fire open-mouthed, her mutch-strings dangling. It was the remark of a stricken mind that speaks vacantly of anything. "Does Herbert Montgomery marry Sir James's niece?" "No," said Janet. "He's killed at the war. It's a gey pity of him, isn't it?" "Oh, what's that?" It was John talking in his sleep. "I have killed my father," he said slowly, pausing long between every phrase. "I have killed my father. I have killed my father. And he's following me. He's following me. He's following me." It was the voice of a thing, not a man. It swelled and dwelt on the follow, as if the horror of the pursuit made it moan. "He's following me. He's following me. He's following me." A face like a dark mist, and een like hell. "Oh, they're following me. They're following me. They're following me." His voice seemed to come from an infinite distance. It was like a lost soul moaning in a solitude. The dog was barking in the street. A cry of the night came from far away. That voice was as if a corpse opened its lips and told of horrors beyond the grave. It brought the other world into the homely room and made it all demoniac. The woman felt the presence of the unknown. It was their own flesh and blood that spoke the words, and by their own quiet hearth. But hell seemed with them in the room. Mrs. Gourlay drew back from John's head on her lap, as from something monstrous and unholy, but he moaned in deprivation, craving her support, and she edged nearer to supply his need. Possessed with a devil or no, he was her son. "Mother!" gasped Janet suddenly, the white circles of her eyes staring from the red flannel, her voice hoarse with a new fear. "Mother, suppose he said that before anybody else?" "Don't mention't," cried her mother with sudden passion. "How dare ye? How dare ye? My God!" She broke down and wept. "They would hang him, so they would. They would hang my boy. They would take and hang my boy." They stared at each other wildly. John slept, his head twisted over on his mother's knee, his eyes sunken, his mouth wide open. "Mother," Janet whispered, "you must send him away." "I have only £3 in the world," said Mrs. Gourlay, and she put her hand to her breast where it was, but winced as if a pain had bitten her. "Send him away wi' it," said Janet. "The furniture may bring something, and you and me can aye thole." In the morning Mrs. Gourlay brought 2 greasy notes to the table, and placed them in her son's slack hand. He was saner now. He had slept off his drunken madness through the night. "John," she said in pitiful appeal, "you maunna stay here, laddie. You'll gie up the drink when you're away, will ye no? And then they een you're sae feared of will no trouble you ony mair. Gang to Glasgow and see the lawyer folk about the bond. And John dear," she pleaded, "if there's nothing left for us, you'll try to work for Janet and me, will ye no? You've a grand education, and you'll surely get a place as a teacher or something. I'm sure you would make a grand teacher. You wouldn't like to think of your mother trailing every week to the like of Wilson for an alms, streaking out her old hand for charity. The folk would stand in their doors to look at me, man. They would that. They would cry ben to each other to come out and see Gourlay's wife gone slinking doon the brae. Doon the brae it would be," she repeated. "Doon the brae it would be." And her mind drifted away on the sorrowful future which her fear made so vivid and real. It was only John's going that roused her. Thomas Brodie, glowering abroad from a shop door festooned in boots, his leather apron in front and his thumbs in the armholes of his waistcoat, as befitted an important man, saw young Gourlay pass the cross with his bag in his hand and dwindle up the road to the station. "Where's he off to now?" he muttered. "There's something at the bottom o' this, if a body could find it out." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The House with the Green Shutters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The House with the Green Shutters by George Douglas Brown. Chapter 27. When John had gone, his mother roused herself to a feverish industry. Even in the early days of her strength, she had never been so busy in her home, but her work was aimless and to no purpose. When tidying, she would take a cup without its saucer from the table, and set off with it through the room, but stopping suddenly in the middle of the floor, would fall into a muse with the dish in her hand, coming to herself long afterwards to ask vaguely, "What's this cup for? Janet, lassie, what was it I was doing?" Her energy and its frustration had the same reason. The burden on her mind constantly impelled her to do something to escape from it, and the same burden paralysed her mind in everything she did. So with another of her vacant whims. Every morning she rose at an unearthly hour, to fish out of old closets rag-bags bellied big with the odds and ends of 30 years' assemblage. "I'll make a patchwork quilt o' the year," she explained, with a foolish eager smile, and she spent hours snatching up rags and vainly trying to match them. But the quilt made no progress. She would look at a patch for a while, with her head on one side, and pat it all over with restless hands. Then she would turn it round, to see if it would look better that way, only to tear it off when it was half sewn, to try another and yet another. Often she would forget the work on her lap and stare across the room open-mouthed, her fingers plucking at her withered throat. Janet became afraid of her mother. Once she saw her smiling to herself, when she thought nobody was watching her. An uncanny smile as of one who hugged a secret to her breast, a secret that, eluding others, would enable its holder to elude them too. What can she have to laugh at? Janet wondered. At times the haze that seemed gathering round Mrs. Gourlay's mind would be dispelled by sudden rushes of fear, when she would whimper lest her son be hanged, or herself come on the parish in her old age. But that was rarely. Her brain was mercifully dulled, and her days were passed in a restless vacancy. She was sitting with the rags scattered round her when John walked in on the evening of the third day. There were rags everywhere, on the table and all about the kitchen. She sat in their midst like a witch among the autumn leaves. When she looked towards his entrance, the smell of drink was wafted from the door. "John," she panted in surprise, "John, did ye not go to Glasgow, boy?" "Ay," he said slowly, "I gaed to Glasgow." "And the bond, John? Did ye speir about the bond?" "Ay," he said, "I spiered about the bond. The whole house is sunk in't." "Oh!" she gasped, and the whole world seemed to go from beneath her, so weak did she feel through her limbs. "John," she said after a while, "did ye no try to get something to do, that ye might help me and Janet now we're helpless?" "No," he said, "for the een wouldna let me. Nicht and day they follow me a'where, nicht and day." "Are they following ye yet, John?" she whispered, leaning forward seriously. She did not try to disabuse him now. She accepted what he said. Her mind was on a level with his own. "Are they following ye yet?" she asked, with large eyes of sympathy and awe. "Ay, and waur than ever, too. They're getting redder and redder." "It's not a dull red," he said, with a faint return of his old interest in the curious physical. "It's a gleaming red. They low. All last nicht they wouldna let me sleep. There was nae gas in my room, and when the candle went out I could see them everywhere. When I looked to one corner o' the room, they were there, and when I looked to another corner, they were there too, glowering at me in the darkness, glowering at me. Ye mind what a glower he had. I hid from them a blow the clays, but they followed me. They were burning in my brain. So I gaed out and stood by a lamp-post for company. But a constable moved me on. He said I was drunk because I muttered to mysell. But I wasna drunk then, mother. I was not. So I walkit on, and on, and on the whole nicht. But I aye keep it to the lamp-post for company. And then, when the public houses opened, I gaed in and drank and drank. I didna like the drink, for whisky has no taste to me now, but it helps ye to forget. Mother, he went on complainingly, is it no queer that a pair of een should follow a man? Just a pair of een. It never happened to onybody but me, he said dully. Never to onybody but me. His mother was panting, open-mouthed, as if she choked for air, both hands clutching at her bosom. Aye, she whispered, it's queer, and kept on gasping at intervals with staring eyes. It's gey queer, it's gey queer, it's gey queer. She took up the needle once more and tried to sew, but her hand was trembling so violently that she pricked the left forefinger which upheld her work. She was content thereafter to make loose stabs at the cloth, with the result that she made great stitches which drew her seam together in a pucker. Vacantly she tried to smooth them out, stroking them over with her hand, constantly stroking and to no purpose. John watched the aimless work with dull and heavy eyes. For a while there was silence in the kitchen. Janet was coughing in the room above. "There's just ae thing'll end it," said John. "Mother, give me 3 shillings." It was not a request, and not a demand. It was the dull statement of a need. Yet the need appeared so relentless, uttered in the set fixity of his impassive voice, that she could not gainsay it. She felt that this was not merely her son making a demand, it was a compulsion on him greater than himself. "There's the money," she said, clinking it down on the table, and flashed a resentful smile at him, close upon the brink of tears. She had a fleeting anger. It was scarcely at him, though. It was at the fate that drove him. Nor was it for herself, for her own mood was, well, let it gang. But she had a sense of unfairness, and a flicker of quite impersonal resentment that fate should wring the last few shillings from a poor being. It wasna fair. She had the emotion of it, and it spoke in the strange look at her son, and in the smiling flush with the tears behind it. Then she sank into apathy. John took up the money and went out, heedless of his mother where she sat by the table. He had a doom on him, and could see nothing that did not lie within his path. Nor did she take any note of his going. She was callous. The tie between them was being annulled by misery. She was ceasing to be his mother, he to be her son. They were not younger and older. They were the equal victims of necessity. Fate set each of them apart to dree a separate weird. In a house of long years of misery, the weak become callous to their dearest's agony. The hard, strong characters are kindest in the end. They will help while their hearts are breaking, but the weak fall asunder at the last. It was not that Mrs. Gourlay was thinking of herself rather than of him. She was stunned by fate, as was he, and could think of nothing. 10 minutes later John came out of the Black Bull with a bottle of whisky. It was a mellow evening, one of those evenings when Barbie, the mean and dull, is transfigured to a gem-like purity, and catches a radiance. There was a dreaming sky above the town, and its light less came to the earth than was on it, shining in every path with a gracious imminence. John came on through the glow with his burden undisguised, wrapped in a tissue paper which showed its outlines. He stared right before him like a man walking in his sleep, and never once looked to either side. At word of his coming, the doors were filled with mutchies and bald heads, keeking by the jambs to get a look. Many were indecent in their haste, not waiting till he passed ere they peeped, which was their usual way. Some even stood away out in front of their doors to glower at him advancing, turning slowly with him as he passed, and glowering behind him as he went. They saw they might do so with impunity, that he did not see them, but walked like a man in a dream. He passed up the street and through the square, beneath 100 eyes, the sun shining softly round him. Every eye followed, till he disappeared through his own door. He went through the kitchen, where his mother sat, carrying the bottle openly, and entered the parlour without speaking. He came back and asked her for the corkscrew, but when she said, "Eh?" with a vague wildness in her manner, and did not seem to understand, he went and got it for himself. She continued making stabs at her cloth, and smoothing out the puckers in her seam. John was heard moving in the parlour. There was a sharp plunk of a cork being drawn, followed by a clink of glass. And then came a heavy thud like a fall. To Mrs. Gourlay the sounds meant nothing. She heard them with her ear, not her mind. The world around her had retreated to a hazy distance, so that it had no meaning. She would have gazed vaguely at a shell about to burst beside her. In the evening, Janet, who had been in bed all the afternoon, came down and lit the lamp for her mother. It was a large lamp which Gourlay had bought, and it shed a rich light through the room. "I heard John come in," she said, turning wearily round, "but I was too ill to come down and ask what had happened. Where is he?" "John?" questioned her mother. "John? Oh, aye," she panted, vaguely recalling. "Oh, aye, I think he gaed ben the parlour." "The parlour?" cried Janet. "But he must be in the dark, and he canna thole the darkness. John!" she cried, going to the parlour door. "John!" There was a silence of the grave. She lit a candle and went into the room. And then she gave a squeal like a rabbit in a dog's jaws. Mrs. Gourlay dragged her gaunt limbs wearily across the floor. By the wavering light, which shook in Janet's hand, she saw her son lying dead across the sofa. The whisky bottle on the table was half empty, and of a smaller bottle beside it he had drunk a third. He had taken all that whisky that he might deaden his mind to the horror of swallowing the poison. His legs had slipped to the floor when he died, but his body was lying back across the couch, his mouth open, his eyes staring horridly up. They were not the eyes of the quiet dead, but bulged in frozen fear, as if his father's eyes had watched him from aloft while he died. "There's 2/3 of the poison left," commented Mrs. Gourlay. "Mother!" Janet screamed and shook her. "Mother, John's deid! John's deid! Don't ye see John's deid?" "Aye, he's deid," said Mrs. Gourlay, staring. "He winna be hanged now." "Mother!" cried Janet, desperate before this apathy. "What shall we do? What shall we do? Shall I run and bring the neebours?" "The neebours!" said Mrs. Gourlay, rousing herself wildly. "The neebours! What have we to do with the neebours? We are by ourselves, the Gourlays whom God has cursed. We can have no neebours. Come ben the house, and I'll tell ye something," she whispered wildly. "Ay," she nodded, smiling with mad significance. "I'll tell ye something. I'll tell ye something." And she dragged Janet to the kitchen. Janet's heart was rent for her brother, but the frenzy on her mother killed sorrow with a new fear. "Janet," smiled Mrs. Gourlay with insane soft interest, "Janet, do ye mind yon nicht lang syne when your faither came in wi' a terrible look in his een and struck me in the breist? Ay," she whispered hoarsely, staring at the fire, "he struck me in the breist. But I didna ken what it was for, Janet. No," she shook her head, "he never telled me what it was for." "Ay, mother," whispered Janet, "I have mind o't." "Weel, an abscess o' some kind formed. I kenna weel what it was, but it gathered and broke, till my breist's near eaten awa wi't. Look!" she cried, tearing open her bosom, and Janet's head flung back in horror and disgust. "Oh, mother!" she panted. "Was it that the wee clouts were for?" "Ay, it was that," said her mother. "Mony a clout I had to wash, and mony a nicht I sat lonely by mysell, plaistering my withered breist. But I never let onybody ken," she added with pride. "No, I never let onybody ken. When your faither nipped me wi' his tongue, it nipped me wi' its pain, and woman, it consoled me. Ay, ay, I used to think, jibe awa, but I hae a freend in my breist that'll end it some day. I like it to keep it to mysell. When it bit me, it seemed to whisper I had a freend that nane o' them kenned o', a freend that would deliver me. The mair he badgered me, the closer I hugged it, and when my heart was bracken, I enjoyed the pain o't." "Oh, my poor, poor mother!" cried Janet with a bursting sob, her eyes raining hot tears. Her very body seemed to feel compassion. It quivered and crept near as though it would brood over her mother and protect her. She raised the poor hand and kissed it, and fondled it between her own. But her mother had forgotten the world in one of her wild lapses, and was staring fixedly. "I'll no lang be a burden to onybody," she said to herself. "It should soon be wearing to a heed now. But I thought of something the day John gaed away. Ay, I thought of something," she said vaguely. "Janet, what was it I was thinking of?" "I dinna ken," whispered Janet. "I was thinking of something," her mother mused. Her voice all through was a far-off voice, remote from understanding. "Yes, I remember. You're young, Jenny, and you learned the dressmaking. Do you think you could sew, or something, to keep a bit garret o'er my heid till I dee?" "Ay, it was that I was thinking of, though it doesna matter much now, eh, Jenny? I'll no bother you for verra lang. But I'll no gang on the parish," she said in a passionless voice. "I'll no gang on the parish. I'm Miss Richmond o' 10 Shilling Land." She had no interest in her own suggestion. It was an idea that had flitted through her mind before, which came back to her now in feeble recollection. She seemed not to wait for an answer, to have forgotten what she said. "Oh, mother!" cried Janet, "there's a curse on us all! I would work my fingers raw for ye if I could, but I canna," she screamed. "I canna, I canna! My lungs are bye wi' it. On Tuesday in Skeighan the doctor telled me I would soon be deid. He didna say it, but fine I saw what he was hinting. He advised me to gang to Ventnor in the Isle of Wight," she added wanly. "As if I could gang to the Isle of Wight! I cam hame trembling and wanted to tell ye, but when I cam in ye were ta'en up wi' John, and, 'Oh, lassie,' said you, 'dinna bother me wi' your complaints enow.' I was hurt at that, and, well, well, I thocht, if she doesna want to hear, I'll no tell her. I was huffed at ye. And then my faither came in, and ye ken what happened. I hadna the heart to speak o't after that. I didna seem to care. I ken what it is to nurse daith in my breast wi' pride too, mother," she went on. "Ye never cared very much for me. It was John was your favourite. I used to be angry because you neglected my illness, and I never telled you how heavily I hosted blood. She'll be sorry for this when I'm deid, I used to think, and I hoped you would be. I had a kind of pride in saying nothing, but, oh, mother, I didna ken you were just the same." She looked. Her mother was not listening. Suddenly Mrs. Gourlay screamed with wild laughter, and laughing, eyed with mirthless merriment the look of horror with which Janet was regarding her. "Ha, ha, ha!" she screamed. "It's to be a clean sweep o' the Gourlays! Ha, ha, ha! It's to be a clean sweep o' the Gourlays!" There is nothing uglier in life than a woman's cruel laugh. But Mrs. Gourlay's laugh was more than cruel. It was demoniac, the skirl of a human being, carried by misery beyond the confines of humanity. Janet stared at her in speechless fear. "Mother," she whispered at last, "what are we to do?" "There's 2/3 of the poison left," said Mrs. Gourlay. "Mother!" cried Janet. "Gourlay's dochter may gang on the parish if she likes, but his wife never will. You may hoast yourself to death in a garret in the poorhouse, but I'll follow my boy." The sudden picture of her own lonely death as a pauper among strangers, when her mother and brother should be gone, was so appalling to Janet that to die with her mother seemed pleasanter. She could not bear to be left alone. "Mother," she cried in a frenzy, "I'll keep ye company." "Let us read a chapter," said Mrs. Gourlay. She took down the big Bible, and the 13th chapter o' 1 Corinthians, she announced in a loud voice, as if giving it out from the pulpit. "The 13th o' the 1 Corinthians. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing." Mrs. Gourlay's manner had changed. She was in the high exaltation of madness. Callous she still appeared, so possessed by her general doom that she had no sense of its particular woes. But she was listless no more. Willing her death, she seemed to borrow its greatness and become one with the law that punished her. Arrogating the Almighty's function to expedite her doom, she was the equal of the Most High. It was her feebleness that made her great, because in her feebleness she yielded entirely to the fate that swept her on. She was imbued with its demoniac power. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. Her voice rose high and shrill as she read the great verses. Her large blue eyes shone with ecstasy. Janet looked at her in fear. This was more than her mother speaking. It was more than human. It was a voice from beyond the world. Alone, the timid girl would have shrunk from death, but her mother's inspiration held her. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. Janet had been listening with such strained attention that the Amen rang out of her loud and involuntary, like an answer to a compelling deity. She had clung to this reading as the one thing left to her before death, and out of her nature thus strained to listen, the Amen came, as sped by an inner will. She scarcely knew that she said it. They rose, and the scrunt of Janet's chair on the floor, when she pushed it behind her, sent a thrilling shiver through her body, so tense was her mood. They stood with their hands on their chair-backs and looked at each other, in a curious palsy of the will. The first step to the parlour door would commit them to the deed. To take it was to take the poison, and they paused, feeling its significance. To move was to give themselves to the irrevocable. When they stirred at length, they felt as if the ultimate crisis had been passed. There could be no return. Mrs. Gourlay had Janet by the wrist. She turned and looked at her daughter, and for one fleeting moment she ceased to be above humanity. "Janet," she said wistfully, "I have had a heap to thole. Maybe the Lord Jesus Christ'll no be ower sair on me." "Oh, mother!" Janet screamed, yielding to her terror when her mother weakened. "Oh, mother, I'm feared, I'm feared! Oh, mother, I'm feared!" "Come," said her mother, "come," and drew her by the wrist. They went into the parlour. The post was a square-built, bandy-legged little man, with a bristle of grizzled hair about his twisted mouth, perpetually cocking up an ill-bred face in the sight of heaven. Physically and morally he had in him something both of the Scotch terrier and the London sparrow, the shagginess of the one, the cocked eye of the other, the one's snarling temper, the other's assured impudence. In Gourlay's day he had never got by the gateway of the yard, much as he had wanted to come further. Gourlay had an eye for a thing like him. "Damn the gurly brute," Posty complained once. "When I passed a pleasant remark about the weather the other morning, he just looked at me and blew the reek of his pipe in my face, and that was his only answer." Now that Gourlay was gone, however, Posty clattered through the yard every morning, right up to the back door. "A heap o' correspondence thir mornings," he would simper, his greedy little eye trying to glean revelations from the women's faces, as they took the letters from his hand. On the morning after young Gourlay came home for the last time, Posty was pelting along with his quick thudding step near the head of the square, when whom should he meet but Sandy Toddle, still unwashed and yawning from his bed. It was early, and the streets were empty, except where in the distance the bent figure of an old man was seen hirpling off to his work, first twisting round stiffly to cock his eye right and left at the sky, to forecast the weather for the day. From the chimneys the fair white spurleys of reek were rising in the pure air. The Gourlays did not seem to be stirring yet. There was no smoke above their roof-tree to show that there was life within. Posty jerked his thumb across his shoulder at the house with the green shutters. "There'll be changes there the day," he said, chirruping. "What?" Toddle breathed in a hoarse whisper of astonishment. "Sequestration?" And he stared big-eyed, with his brows arched. "Something of that kind," said the post carelessly. "I'm no weel acquaint wi' the lawyer's lingo." "Will't be true, think ye?" said Sandy. "God, it's true," said the post. "I had it frae Jock Hutchison, the clerk in Skeighan Gowdie's. He got fou yestreen on the road to Barbie, and blabbed it. He'll lose his job, yon chap, if he doesna keep his mouth shut. True, ay, it's true. There's damn the doubt o' that." Toddle corrugated his mouth to whistle. He turned and stared at the house with the green shutters, gawky and substantial on its terrace, beneath the tremulous beauty of the dawn. There was a glorious sunrise. "God," he said, "what a downcome for that hoose!" "Is it no?" chuckled Posty. "Whose account is it on?" said Toddle. "Oh, I don't ken," said Posty carelessly. "He had creditors a' ower the country. I was aye bringing the big blue envelopes from different airts. Don't mention this now," he added, his finger up, his eye significant. "It shouldn't be known at all." He was unwilling that Toddle should get an unfair start and spoil his own market for the news. "Not me," Toddle assured him grandly, shaking his head as who should conduct of that kind 1,000 miles off. "Not me, Post. I'll no breathe it to a living soul." The post clattered into Mrs. Gourlay's back door. He had a heavy understamped letter on which there was threepence to pay. He might pick up an item or two while she was getting him the bawbees. He knocked, but there was no answer. "The sluts," said he with a humph of disgust. "They're still on their backs, it seems." He knocked again. The sound of his knuckles on the door rang out hollowly, as if there was nothing but emptiness within. While he waited, he turned on the step and looked idly at the courtyard. The in-walled little place was curiously still. At last, in his impatience, he turned the handle, when to his surprise the door opened, and let him enter. The leaves of a Bible fluttered in the fresh wind from the door. A large lamp was burning on the table. Its big yellow flame was unnatural in the sunshine. "Humph," said Posty, tossing his chin in disgust. "Little wonder everything gaed to wreck and ruin in this house. The slovens have left a lamp burning the whole nicht lang. But less licht'll serve them now, I'm thinking." A few dead ashes were sticking from the lower bars of the range. Posty crossed to the fireplace and looked down at the fender. That bright spot would be the place, now, where auld Gourlay killed himself. The women must have rubbed it so bright in trying to get out the blood. It was an uncanny thing to keep in the house, that. He stared at the fatal spot till he grew eerie in the strange stillness. "Good wife!" he cried. "Jennet, don't ye hear?" They did not hear, it seemed. "God," said he, "they sleep sound after all their misfortunes." At last, partly in impatience and partly from a wish to pry, he opened the door of the parlour. "Oh, my God!" he screamed, leaping back, and with his bulky bag got stuck in the kitchen door in his desperate hurry to be gone. He ran round to the square in front and down to Sandy Toddle, who was informing a bunch of unshaven bodies that the Gourlays were sequestered. "Oh, my God, Post, what have you seen to bring that look to your eyes? What have you seen, man? Speak, for God's sake! What is it?" The post gasped and stammered, then, "Ooh!" he shivered in horror, and covered his eyes at a sudden picture in his brain. "Speak," said a man solemnly. They have all killed themselves," stammered the postman, pointing to the Gourlays. Their loins were loosened beneath them. The scrape of their feet on the road, as they turned to stare, sounded monstrous in the silence. No man dared to speak. They gazed with blanched faces at the house with the green shutters, sitting dark there and terrible beneath the radiant arch of the dawn. End of chapter 27. End of The House with the Green Shutters by George Douglas Brown